Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. Napoleon was now famous throughout France. He had come a long way in just over a year. Back in the spring of 1796, on his way to begin his command in Italy, Napoleon had passed through Auxonne, where he had once been garrisoned as a young lieutenant. He stopped at the door of the barber shop and asked his pretty, flirtatious former landlady if she remembered a young officer by the name of Bonaparte, who had once lodged with her family. "Indeed I do," she replied. And a very disagreeable lodger he was too. He was always either shut up in his room, or if he walked out, he never stopped to speak to anyone. Napoleon replied, "Ah, my good woman, had I passed my time as you wish me to have, I would not now be in command of the army of Italy." On his return to Paris, after his glorious victories, Napoleon stopped at the barber shop again and cheerfully called out to her, "We're back!" And the memory of the shy lieutenant was forgotten in the image of the heroic general fresh from victory. On the 5th of December 1797, Napoleon returned home to Paris, to the Rue Chantereine, soon to be renamed the Rue de la Victoire in his honour. Paris's response to the returning hero was euphoric, and Napoleon was virtually besieged in his own house. Even his stepdaughter, Hortense, found it difficult to get to see him. All of Paris rang with his name. The people crowded in such vast numbers to cheer the conqueror of Italy that the sentries stationed on the Rue de la Victoire could hardly hold them back. But when he stepped inside, Napoleon found that his and Josephine's little temple of love had been changed beyond all recognition. Josephine had mentioned that she had done a little redecorating. After all, their modest little house was no longer suitable for the conqueror of Italy. But Napoleon was totally unprepared for the splendour, in the latest elegance, that confronted him. There was a monumental new entrance, decorated with martial motifs. The dining room was paved with mosaics, and the pièce de résistance, the boudoir, was now a mock soldier's tent, with white and blue striped canvas billowing from the ceiling. As all the furniture was specially designed, by no less than Marie Antoinette's favourites, the Jacob brothers. Much to Napoleon's dismay, the renovation was far from complete, and more furniture was arriving daily. But if the revamped house was breathtaking to behold, then it was also colossally expensive. Over 2 decades later, Napoleon was still in disbelief at the exact cost of it, which came to a staggering 300,000 francs, almost 10 times the worth of the house itself, which was still only rented. But Napoleon had little time to brood over his wife's extravagance. He was the man of the hour, and everyone wanted to share in his triumph. Napoleon's first visitor was the director, Paul Barras, who stayed with him until long after midnight. Even so, Napoleon got up early the next morning to visit Talleyrand at the Foreign Ministry. In a long conversation, Napoleon and Talleyrand sized each other up, and both liked what they saw. In the current political climate, Talleyrand advised Napoleon to be on his guard. On the 10th of December, Napoleon attended a grand official welcoming ceremony held in his honour at the Luxembourg Palace. Napoleon was cheered, as no French general had ever been cheered before. Yet, one Briton living in Paris at the time noted that, as he passed through the crowded streets, he leaned back in his carriage and seemed as if he wished to escape from the general bursts of applause. Trying to avoid the immense crowds in the main thoroughfares, he arrived there by the back streets. Against the backdrop of the palace, an altar to the patrie had been put up, with his captured enemy flags and a specially built amphitheatre with statues of liberty, equality and peace. In front of the altar sat the 5 directors, and when Napoleon appeared, everyone stood up and took off their hats. Napoleon was wearing a simple uniform, standing unassumingly. Then he handed the directors the Treaty of Campo Formio, and they then delivered flattering speeches, praising Bonaparte's insatiable love of the patrie and humanity, and referring to him as the son and hero of the revolution. Talleyrand ended his speech by pointing out Napoleon's contempt for pomp and luxury. Far from fearing what some would call his ambition, I feel that one day we may have to implore him to tear himself away from the calm of his studious retreat. Paul Barras, on the other hand, struck a completely different note. Though lauding that nature had exhausted all her powers in the creation of a Bonaparte, and comparing him to Socrates, Pompey and Caesar, Barras also mentioned the French forces gathering along the coast for an invasion of England, which had by now swept the French navy from the oceans. Barras urged Napoleon to march to the banks of the Thames to purge the world of the monsters, by which he meant England's Tory government, who oppress and dishonour the English nation. Barras concluded, "May St. James's Palace crumble into the dust. Your country wishes it, humanity requires it, revenge demands it." But, towards the end of this grave speech, the beautiful socialite, Madame Récamier, stood up in her radiant white dress to get a better view of Napoleon. If Bonaparte was the lion of the day, then Madame Récamier was the lioness, and she could not leave her house without having an admiring crowd of 200 or 300 people at her heels. As soon as she was spotted, the audience, who had had their gazes fixed on Napoleon, suddenly only had eyes for her, followed by long admiring murmurs. Noticing their distraction, Napoleon looked around sharply. Awestruck under his severe expression, Madame Récamier quickly dropped back to her seat. Napoleon now made his own short speech, setting the Italian campaign into perspective. Citizens, the French people, in order to be free, had kings to combat. To obtain a constitution founded on reason, it had the prejudices of 18 centuries to overcome. Religion, feudalism and monarchy have, successively, for 2,000 years, governed Europe. From the peace you have just concluded dates the era of representative governments. You have succeeded in organizing this great nation, whose vast territory is circumscribed only because nature herself has fixed its limits. You have done even more. The 2 most beautiful countries in Europe, once so famous for the arts, sciences, and the great men whose cradle they were, behold with the greatest hopes, genius and freedom, rising from the tomb of their ancestors. I have the honour to deliver to you the treaty signed at Campo Formio and ratified by the Emperor of Austria. Peace secures the liberty, the prosperity, and the glory of the Republic. As soon as the happiness of France is secured by the best coherent laws, the whole of Europe will be free." Then Barras and all the other directors publicly embraced Napoleon, his old school friend and now private secretary, Orient, cynically concluded, each acted to the best of his ability, his part in this sentimental comedy. Another observed, an icy coldness characterized the ceremony. Everyone seemed to be there only for the purpose of beholding a sight, and curiosity rather than joy seemed to influence the assembly. The cheers of the crowd contrasted with the cold praises of the Directory. In public, Napoleon's bearing was modest and unassuming. No one would have believed he was proud of his achievements. Nervous politicians tried to court him, but he only remained polite and respectful. Even schemers like Barras and Talleyrand were puzzled. Here was a man whose genius was being talked about as far away as Moscow and Lisbon, who every honourable citizen admired, and every ranker in the Republican armies adored. Yet he showed no signs of recognising the power that was his for the taking. Everywhere he went, crowds flocked to cheer Napoleon, and he acknowledged their cheers with an absent-minded lift of the hand. But Napoleon was not deluded by the crowd's excitement. The Parisians retained no impression. The people would flock just as quickly to see me if I were on the way to the guillotine. In order to avoid this unpleasant fate, all too common during the tumultuous politics of the time, Napoleon did not want to come across as a latter-day Alexander the Great. His position was delicate. The directors were well aware that they were as unpopular as Napoleon was admired. When he was with one or even all of the directors, they were completely ignored and overshadowed. He represented a real threat to them. Lord Malmesbury, the British envoy sent there by Prime Minister William Pitt to try to finally negotiate peace with the Directory, noted that new political figures were waiting in the wings, including young General Bonaparte, who he called a clever, desperate Jacobin terrorist. A committee of the Council of Ancients now tried to pass an act rewarding Napoleon with land in Chambord and a large Parisian mansion, but the directors opposed it. But Napoleon showed himself a man indifferent to material riches and made no demands. His lack of ostentation supported the claim that he, alone of all the generals in Italy, had lived on his pay and allowances, and had left all the loot to the little men. This stance was an enormous success, and left his audience wanting more. For his modesty and moderation, people began to reason that here, perhaps, was the man who could not only rescue France, but rebuild her. The anniversary of King Louis XVI's death by the guillotine had been made a national holiday in France, but Napoleon disapproved of this and made his opinion known. This holiday is odious. It commemorates an event that is a catastrophe, a true national misfortune. In private, Napoleon remarked, the directors cannot long keep their position. They do not know how to do anything for the imagination of the nation. It is said that the directors at last grew so annoyed by Napoleon's criticism that they seriously considered having him arrested. They went to Fouché, their minister of police. But the wily Fouché replied, Napoleon Bonaparte is not the man to be arrested. Neither is Fouché the man who will undertake to arrest him. Napoleon always looked back on this period in Paris as being fraught with danger, not least because the soldiers would shout out in the streets, "He ought to be king! We must make him king!" Napoleon even grew concerned that his life was in danger from an assassin's dagger. Some noticed that he rarely took off his boots, as if always ready for a quick departure. And at public dinners, fearing he might be poisoned, a servant usually kept an eye on his food and wine, as many people thought had just caused the death of General Hoche. Wisely, Napoleon played down his achievements, avoided politics, rarely appeared in public, and only saw his circle of family and friends. Napoleon's whole family congregated in Paris, forming a Bonaparte colony, as the Parisians called it. According to Napoleon's expressed desire, the whole family lived as simply as possible. Napoleon's determination to shun society, to fly from all eyes and withhold himself from all tributes, was widely noticed. On the 20th of December, a writer for the Le Moniteur newspaper reported that, Bonaparte goes out rarely, and when he does, it is alone in a carriage pulled by 2 horses. He can be seen frequently walking in his little garden. On one of his few outings, to indulge his passion for the theatre, Napoleon's reaction to the audience's wild cheers was to simply withdraw into the shadow of his box. When the opera house had wanted to arrange a play in his honour, he declined. But Napoleon was immensely happy on Christmas Day, when he was elected a member of the Institut de France, which was, and still is, the leading intellectual society in France. With the help of his new scientist friends, Napoleon won the support of 305 of the 312 members. In Napoleon's acceptance speech, he announced that he wanted to devote himself to intellectual endeavour. "I am only too aware that before becoming their equal, I must long stay their pupil. I shall bury myself in a retreat and labour in order to deserve one day the honour of being a member of the Institute. The most honourable occupation, as well as the most useful for nations, is to contribute to the extension of human ideas. The true power of the French Republic must henceforth consist in not allowing a single new idea to exist that does not belong to it." One eyewitness, von Humboldt, remembered that there were many spectators, and all eyes were on him, and, after studying Napoleon, gave his own detailed description of him. His eyes are large, deep-set, and finely contoured. His nose curved, but not hooked. His mouth and chin are very masculine, strong, and his chin is especially strong, though without giving an air of harshness or pride. As he is rather lean, his cheekbones are pronounced, and all the muscles of his face move when he speaks, even his nose. His appearance has nothing large about it, or heavy, or determined, and he seems to exude more intellectual than moral qualities. He seems calm, pensive, decisive, and although he has a strong and justified pride, he seems relaxed, perceptive, and very serious, as if he is committed only to his work, without any other penchants or interests. Sometimes, his expression takes on a harder and cutting edge, especially when he is moving. It would be difficult to imagine him in action, and even more difficult to imagine him enthusiastic. His face is quite modern, and in my opinion, is more French than Italian. In terms of the intellectuality of his expression, he could be an example of the ideal of the modern. Napoleon would often attend science lectures at the Institut de France, wear their dark blue uniform, and sign himself as member of the Institute. It was not just the French people that he impressed with these intellectual credentials, later saying, "I well knew that there was not a drummer in the army that would not respect me the more for believing me to be not a mere soldier." With all the popular hysteria, it's easy to see why France's most famous artist, the classical painter Jacques-Louis David, was so taken by Napoleon's appearance after the victorious young general swept into Paris. After he had caught sight of Napoleon, David was in raptures. "Oh, my friends, what a beautiful head he has! It's pure, it's grand, it's as beautiful as antiquity. Here is a man to whom altars would have been raised in ancient times. Yes, my friends, yes, my dear friends, Bonaparte is my hero." David took Napoleon as his muse, and they would soon begin a long and fruitful artistic collaboration. He was not Napoleon's only new admirer. The colourful, eccentric writer, Madame de Stael, reigned over the Paris salons, famed for her intellectual brilliance and her witty repartee. A leading writer of the Romanticism movement in French literature, Madame de Stael was as passionate and outspoken as possible, once sighing that one must choose in life between boredom and suffering. She was not a beauty, and with a forceful personality and a sharp mind, she would have made a wonderful man, Lord Byron later claimed. The daughter of the stupendously rich banker, Jacques Necker, Madame de Stael spent her childhood in her mother's famous salon, where she was given a rigorous education based on Rousseau's ideas, and as a girl had met leading Enlightenment thinkers, including Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, and Horace Walpole. Famously falling on her face in front of the entire French court when bending down to kiss Queen Marie Antoinette's robes, Madame de Stael had come close to marrying England's future Prime Minister, William Pitt, but instead found herself in a cold marriage of political convenience to a Swedish baron, who left her much to her own devices, at which she took a string of lovers, including the refined Comte de Narbonne, and later the liberal politician Benjamin Constant. With the outbreak of the French Revolution, she had taken an active role in politics, and had rejoiced at the meeting of the Estates General in 1789, which had launched the downfall of the king. A woman of contradictions, she would later try to arrange Louis XVI's escape from Paris. And yet, the Revolution's constitution was written in her house. Madame de Stael set up her own salon, starring an array of talented minds, including Talleyrand, Lafayette, the philosopher Condorcet, and Thomas Jefferson. Then she fled Robespierre's terror to briefly live in exile. Now 31, while Napoleon was conquering Italy, Madame de Stael dreamt of her own conquest, and for many months had been growing infatuated with him from afar. During one dinner, she praised Napoleon with all the fire and exaggeration of inspiration throughout the entire meal, and when she was about to enter a room, she stepped aside to let Napoleon's aide-de-camp, Colonel Lavalette, enter first, with the words, "How could I dare to walk in front of one of Bonaparte's officers?" She had written Napoleon many flattering letters while he was on campaign, calling him Scipio and Tancred, uniting the simple virtues of the former with the brilliant deeds of the latter. Oblivious to the fact that she was the sort of loud, pushy woman that Napoleon found so off-putting, she continued to bombard him with letters, believing that she and Napoleon seemed born for each other, and that it appeared that nature had only gifted her with so passionate a character in order to allow her to admire such a hero as him. She claimed that she herself was a more suitable match for him than Josephine, and urged him to discard that little insignificant Creole, because to unite his genius with someone like her was nothing short of a monstrosity, as she could never appreciate him. When he'd read these lines, Napoleon had murmured, "This woman is mad. This manufacturer of sentiments dares to compare herself with Josephine," and he tore the letter up, refusing to send her any replies. Though this did not deter Madame de Stael, who continued to pour out her adoration to the god who had descended on earth. On Napoleon's return to Paris, she even tried to storm his house in the Rue de la Victoire. When told by the butler that the general was in the bath and was not able to see her, she still tried to barge past, crying out, "No matter, genius has no sex." At the end of December, Napoleon made an exception to his virtual ban on appearing in public to attend a ball hosted by Talleyrand. With his unerring political tact, Talleyrand decided to dedicate the evening to Josephine rather than to her husband, which had a double advantage for him. Talleyrand avoided making a public political commitment to Napoleon, while at the same time touching on his Achilles heel, his love for Josephine. Talleyrand had designed an evening reminiscent of the luxurious but dignified galas of the Ancien Regime. No effort or expense had been spared, with hordes of carpenters, painters, decorators, florists and caterers transforming the sumptuous venue. The only problem was that Josephine was not there. She was still travelling in Italy. Talleyrand hastily cancelled the ball. At great effort and expense, all the food was reordered, the decorations stripped and replaced. But the new date dawned, and there was still no sign of Josephine, so Talleyrand was forced to postpone the ball again. Josephine had decided to visit Venice, where Austria's new mastery of it had not yet become common knowledge. Hoping to appease Napoleon after their massacres of French soldiers, and eager to catch a glimpse of the famous general's wife, the Venetians welcomed Josephine extravagantly, with 150,000 of them cheering loudly, hanging out of the windows, waving banners and throwing flowers. For 4 days, the city was en fête. There was a ball at the Doge's palace, fireworks, and a special performance given for her at the opera. There were picnics and water excursions along the Grand Canal, where Josephine's ship was followed by hundreds of boats, garlanded with flowers, serenading her with Italian music. 1,000 gondolas, themselves covered with different coloured lights, gave the appearance of a whole city in movement. Josephine not only took home with her the good wishes of the Italians, but boxes packed with gifts from those eager to ingratiate themselves with her husband, and rattling by her side in the carriage, a well-filled jewellery box. Allegedly, Hippolyte Charles also joined Josephine at least part of the way when she journeyed back to Paris in late November, passing through towns decorated and illuminated in her honour. Beneath triumphal arches, Josephine was welcomed with speeches and proclamations, the roar of cannon, cheers of the National Guard, and poems dedicated to her. Companion of the hero admired by every nation, in our hearts acclaim his source of inspiration. Josephine graciously replied, "My husband has been so successful because he has had the good fortune to command an army in which every soldier is a hero." At last, Josephine arrived back in Paris, and Talleyrand's ball could go ahead. On the evening of the 3rd of January 1798, carriages stretched back all the way to the Seine. Passing through its grand columns, the guests found themselves inside the first of the courtyards, where Talleyrand, in obvious tribute to Napoleon, had recreated a military camp, complete with tents, fires, and uniformed soldiers. In the next was a mock antique shrine, dominated by a bust of Brutus. When the guests entered the reception rooms, they were enveloped in a spell of light, fragrance, and soft music. At the top of the majestic double staircase draped in myrtle stood the host himself, Talleyrand, impeccably dressed as usual, leaning on his cane. Those in his favour received a firm handshake, the less important, 2 limp fingers. The evening was in full swing when the Bonapartes themselves arrived at 10:30. At the first sight of the Conqueror and his wife, the guests fell silent. Both Napoleon and Josephine had struck exactly the right note of restraint, him wearing his famously unobtrusive grey coat, Josephine in a deceptively simple gown, with a small gold diadem of antique cameos. So obvious was the crowd's reverence that even Napoleon was intimidated by it. Their hushed, almost religious stillness was more impressive and unsettling than any applause or bravos. Catching sight of his friend Arnaud, he grabbed him by the arm and started talking to him to avoid speaking to anyone else. The only false note in Talleyrand's impeccably orchestrated evening was struck by the famous intellectual, Madame de Stael, still as obsessed with Napoleon as ever, but the feeling was not reciprocated. He found her exasperatingly pretentious and overbearing, and trying to avoid her, had recently turned down an invitation to another ball held in his honour because she had been invited too. At other events, he had tried to evade her, but now there was no escape. To Talleyrand's fury, Madame de Stael pushed herself forward and insisted on being presented to Bonaparte. His stepdaughter, Hortense, later recalled, "She kept following the general about all the time, boring him to a point where he could not, and perhaps did not, sufficiently attempt to hide his annoyance." She then bombarded Napoleon with prying questions, the last of which were, "General, who is the woman you love best?" "My wife," Napoleon answered quickly. "Of course. And the one you esteem the most?" "The one who takes the best care of her household." "But which woman, alive or dead, do you most admire?" Clearly expecting him to say something polite, or a compliment about her own intellect and literary talent, Napoleon's reply was unsparing. "She who has had the most children, madame." On which retort, Napoleon turned on his heel and walked away from her. Almost, for once, lost for words, Madame de Stael could only say, "Extraordinary man." As a throwaway remark to a near stalker, Napoleon's insult did the trick. Unfortunately, the general's only response was an indifference which women never forgive, and which indeed, he added with a smile, is hardly to be forgiven. But the spurned Madame de Stael refused to be beaten so easily, and was to become one of his most vocal critics and a persistent thorn in his side. After a sumptuous dinner, when Josephine was serenaded by the famous opera singer Lay, the Bonapartes left the ball just after 1 o'clock in the morning, but many guests stayed until dawn, and a new dance, called the waltz, was introduced for the first time that evening. The ball was considered a resounding success. One writer described it as one of those gestures which are more decisive than battles. Through the style of the event, Talleyrand had conveyed a subtle message to Napoleon about what he could offer. His role would be a master of ceremonies, cultivating the past and its rituals, and making them fruitful in the new age. But one person that did not seem to enjoy the ball was the guest of honour herself, Josephine. Some observed that she appeared distracted, others that she was less gracious than usual and seemed out of sorts. She had certainly been arguing with Napoleon, who was livid at the exorbitant cost of her redecorating and resented her delayed return, which Josephine justified by claiming she was just being a good wife by accepting accolades on his behalf. The little storm soon passed. Napoleon and Josephine led a quiet, retired life. Once, when it was time for their guests to leave the dinner table to take coffee, Josephine gently tapped her husband on the shoulder, at which Napoleon joked that his guest should note that his wife was in the habit of beating him. The core of their social circle stayed the same: dinner parties with Barras, Madame Talleyrand, and the actor Talma, and new allies like Talleyrand, as well as some of Napoleon's newer friends, the academics and scientists of the Institut de France, poets like Arnaud and Chenière, and the painter Davy. The newspapers continued to marvel at Napoleon's lack of ambition and his quiet existence. As one wrote, he avoids anything which might draw attention to himself. His wife, too, has adopted a way of life as retiring as his own. However, a storm was once again brewing at the Rue de la Victoire. Napoleon's brothers, especially Joseph, now despised Josephine, and Lucien was writing long letters to Napoleon about her real and supposed indiscretions. But the Bonapartes were not alone in trying to cause trouble. After returning from Italy, Josephine had dismissed her maid when she discovered that the girl had been sleeping with Napoleon's friend, General Junot. The vengeful maid went to see Napoleon and told him that a young soldier, Hippolyte, who she described as a little whorish creature, had joined Josephine on her return from Italy, shared her carriage, and spent the nights in the same inns. Napoleon confronted Josephine. "Tell me the truth. After all, there is no great wrong in sleeping in the same inn, or making the journey together." No, it isn't true," Josephine cried, and burst into tears. Weeping always disarmed her husband, and for now, Napoleon's questions stopped. Since his return from Italy, Napoleon had been given a new job, commander of the army against England. In February 1798, Napoleon travelled to the northwest coast of France to inspect in blustery gales the French troops and ships that had been amassed along the Channel. The directors hoped that Napoleon would lead them against England, the only country still at war with France. The English had been watching Napoleon's Italian campaign with great interest. After his victory at Lodi the year before, spirits in Britain had fallen, as the public thought that Italy would now be blocked to trade. That August, Spain had also signed peace with France, and in October had declared war on Britain, forcing British fleets from the Mediterranean. Worse still, in early December, news had arrived that the pro-English Catherine the Great of Russia had died, causing more alarm, since her heir, Tsar Paul II, was known to favour France. Prime Minister William Pitt wrote to his friend Dundas, "I'm afraid much good is not to be expected from the new emperor. It is difficult to say whether one ought to regret most that she had not died sooner or lived longer." Meanwhile, the British public, as in other countries, had followed Napoleon's progress through Italy with amazement. The name of Bonaparte, or Buonaparte, which emphasized his Corsican origin, was scattered through the press. For the past year, the Times newspaper had published translations of his bulletins, claiming they were arrogant and damning the excitement of sympathizers. The insolence which prevails in General Bonaparte's proclamation to his army is equalled only by the exaggerated enthusiasm with which some of our ministers celebrate the exploits of that young warrior, stormed one. Britain's current Prime Minister, William Pitt, was the leader of the Conservative Party then in power. Determined to expand England's influence and growing colonial empire, Pitt had been staunchly anti-French even before the Revolution and was bent on continuing the war against the spread of its ideas. Pitt's rival, against whom he would fight a long political duel, was Charles Fox, leader of the opposition party, the Whigs, later renamed the Liberal Party. Fox admired the progressive ideals of the French Revolution and supported reform, both against corruption in Parliament and England's restricted voting system at the time, as well as promoting civil liberties and religious tolerance. Like Fox and his Whigs, there were some passionate British radicals, to whom Napoleon was the fiery leader the French needed. That January, the Secret Committee of England wrote encouragingly to the Directory of the planned French invasion, "We now only await with impatience to see the hero of Italy and the brave veterans of the great nation. Myriads will hail their arrival with shouts of joy. They will soon finish the glorious campaign." But there were arguments, even among Britons who wanted a republic, as some saw Napoleon as the would-be saviour of France, others that the spirit of the revolution had been lost in a desire for conquest. By now, Prime Minister William Pitt's promised short war against France had stretched on for over 4 years. Almost every Briton longed for the war to end. King George III was inundated with petitions, urging him to dismiss the ministers who were waging this long, disastrous, unjust, and unnecessary war. Fears of invasion by the French grew. From the start of the year, the British public were bombarded with talk of Napoleon's invasion plans. He had built great rafts, it was said, 1,000 feet long and able to carry 60,000 cavalry, infantry and artillery, powered by windmills. More realistic reports also filtered in that flat-bottomed boats, designed for beach landings, were being built in France, and that small boats and trading ships were being commandeered from all the French fishing ports. As part of a wave of British propaganda, the poet laureate, Henry James Pye, added a new verse to the national anthem, roared out in assemblies and at parades, including the lines, "Lead forth our monarch's host, check proud invasion's boast, crushed on our warlike coast, whelmed by our wave." That March, the caricaturist Gilray's political cartoon, Promised Horrors, showed St. James's Palace in flames. Now, in his Consequences of a Successful French Invasion, a French whip-wielding slave driver proclaimed, "Me teach the English Republican to work." London newspapers reported that the French fleet was preparing to sail from Brest, and people walking on the beach at Eastbourne claimed to hear guns firing in the Channel. The British printmakers stepped up their efforts. Gilray and other caricaturists like Cruikshank produced fantastical scenarios of patriots and traitors. The emblem of England, John Bull, toppling Frenchmen like bowling pins. Or the Whig Party leader, Charles Fox, who was against the war, helping to tow the French invasion fleet ashore. Pamphlets warned that a peaceful rural life would disappear. They wrote of France's demonic trickery. When they landed their soldiers, they would at first appear disciplined to win people's confidence. Like spiders, they artfully weave a web around their victim before they begin to prey upon it. But when their success is complete, they then let loose their troops with resistless fury to commit the most horrible excesses and to pillage, burn and desolate without mercy and without distinction. Above all, a horror that will make your blood freeze in your veins, they would violate the women with savage ferocity. Will you, my countrymen, while you can draw a trigger or handle a pike, suffer your daughters, your sisters and your wives to fall into the power of such monsters? Republican spies were said to be creeping around London, testing the mood to see if the people would rise up to support General Bonaparte, the bringer of liberty. But according to the pamphlets, he was no champion of liberty, but an upstart, a monster, a butcher, a demon, a fiend. Meanwhile, Napoleon carefully studied the realities of invading England. He visited Boulogne, Dunkirk, Calais, Brussels and Douai to evaluate the chances of a successful invasion, interviewing sailors, captains, smugglers and fishermen, sometimes until midnight. Napoleon noted that most of the French troops were new recruits, the officers untried, and they were short of ships and equipment. The year before, the English navy had destroyed the fleets of France's allies, Spain and Holland, and now held undisputed mastery of the seas. To invade England, the plan was to first land French troops in Ireland, which had recently broken out into pro-independence revolts against the British government. To gain his help, Napoleon met Wolfe Tone, the leader of the rebel United Irishmen and known as the father of Irish republicanism. When Tone told him that he was not a military man and could not be of much use, Napoleon interrupted him. "But you're brave." Tone modestly agreed that he was indeed. "Eh bien, that will suffice." But the fact that weighed heavily on Napoleon was that 2 months earlier, France's other top general, Hoche, had, with Tone's help, failed to land his own force in Ireland. Yet Hoche had only had 15,000 men. What would it be like trying to get 100,000 men across the Channel? Napoleon looked across the grey choppy waters and decided against invading England, telling his private secretary, Bourrienne, "Too chancy. I don't intend to risk la belle France on the throw of a dice." Napoleon's report to the Directory was unequivocal. "Whatever efforts we make, we shall not, for some years, gain naval supremacy. To invade England without that supremacy is the most daring and difficult task ever undertaken. If, having regard to the current organisation of our navy, it seems impossible to gain the promptness of execution needed, then we must really give up the invasion against England, be satisfied with keeping up the pretence of it, and concentrate all our attention and resources on the Rhine in order to try to deprive England of Hanover, or else undertake an eastern expedition which would menace her trade with the Indies. And if none of these 3 operations are practicable, I see nothing else for it but to conclude peace." Napoleon now thought of quite another invasion, one that he believed would strike a blow at England, almost as severe as landing on their coast. He would invade Egypt. This idea has often been described as an adventurer's reckless fantasy, the dream of a would-be Alexander the Great. But it was a much less risky operation than invading England, which is precisely the reason why Napoleon chose it. Neither was it a new idea. The plan had been floating around the French Foreign Ministry since the year of Napoleon's birth, as a way of compensating France for the loss of her American colonies. It was an ambitious undertaking, which included rebuilding the ancient Suez Canal as a new trading route, which would undermine England's grip on the world's then key but much longer shipping route, the Cape of Good Hope. And planting cotton, indigo and sugar alongside more traditional Egyptian crops, which would bring about a revolution in world trade that would give France a grip on the route to India, which was then in English hands. It was Napoleon who brought this plan to fruition. The idea had ripened while he had been in Italy. After all, the Roman Republic had made Egypt a province, and Venice had become rich through the Egyptian spice trade. In being granted the Ionian Islands in the peace treaty with Austria, Napoleon had also just gained the necessary line of communications. From these different posts, we shall command the Mediterranean. We shall keep an eye upon the Ottoman Empire, which is crumbling to pieces, and we shall have it in our power to make the dominion of the ocean almost useless to England, They have possession of the Cape of Good Hope. We can do without it. Let us occupy Egypt. We shall be in the direct road for India. It will be easy for us to found there one of the finest colonies in the world. It is in Egypt that we must attack England. There were three purposes to the Egyptian expedition. First, Napoleon would occupy Egypt, free it from its ruling foreign tyrants, the Mamelukes, and develop it as a French colony. Little resistance was expected. Egypt was a weak, subject state, although, in name only, it belonged to the Sultan of Turkey. Napoleon was keen to ensure at all costs that Turkey would not go to war with him over Egypt. Therefore, he arranged that after he had occupied the country and was in a position of strength, Talleyrand was to travel to Constantinople on his behalf and negotiate a favourable treaty. Talleyrand's promise to do so was an integral part of Napoleon's plan, but Talleyrand had no intention whatsoever of actually doing so. As he said privately of Napoleon to the directors, "Give him employment a few thousand miles away, and there will be one less troublemaker at home. Let him do the heavy work, and if he succeeds, so much the better, and if he fails, good riddance." This would be the first time, but by no means the last time, that Talleyrand was to mislead Napoleon. The second purpose of the expedition was to strike at England's richest possession, India. This could be done either over land, in alliance with Turkey and Persia, or, more ambitiously, by rebuilding the ancient Suez Canal, which would allow French fleets into the Red Sea, and from there to sail to India. The expedition's third purpose originated with Napoleon and was an entirely new concept. The French, as Napoleon saw it, would go to Egypt to teach and to learn. They would teach because Egypt was a backwards country, and he believed that France had a great modernizing mission to fulfill. In the Directory's instructions to the Commander-in-Chief, which in fact were written up by Napoleon, it stated that he will use all the means in his power to improve the lot of the natives of Egypt. The latest medical, scientific, and technological knowledge will be placed at the Egyptians' disposal. At the same time, the French were to learn about a country virtually unknown to Europe. They would explore, they would map, they would observe, and record history and natural phenomena. It would not only be a voyage of military conquest, but also of scientific discovery. Napoleon proposed to the Directory that the expedition should also seek to advance the progress of knowledge and the development of science and the arts. This idea caused surprise, but no opposition. As Napoleon outlined to the Directory, once established in Egypt, the Mediterranean becomes a French lake. We shall found a colony there, unenervated by the curse of slavery, and which will supply the place of San Domingo. We shall open a market for French manufacturers through the vast regions of Africa, Arabia, and Syria. All the caravans of the East will meet at Cairo, and the commerce of India must forsake the Cape of Good Hope and flow through the Red Sea. Marching with an army of 60,000 men, we can cross the Indus, rouse the oppressed and discontented native peoples against the English usurpers, and drive the English out of India. We will found governments which will respect the rights and promote the interests of the people. The masses will hail us as their deliverers from oppression. The Christians of Syria, the Druzes and the Armenians will join our standards. We may change the face of the world. For Napoleon, the idea of Egypt also represented an opportunity to follow in the footsteps of both of his greatest heroes, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. I felt that I could abandon myself to the most brilliant dreams. I was full of dreams. I saw myself founding a new religion, marching into Asia riding an elephant, a turban on my head, and in my hands the new Koran. He told his secretary, Bourrienne, "Europe is a molehill. We must set off for the Orient. That is where all the greatest glory has been achieved." However, at times, It seemed as if Napoleon had second thoughts. I thought that this enterprise might be detrimental to the true interests of the country. I said to the Directory that Europe was far from calm, and they were forced to keep troops in the interior to monitor the elections and all the western departments. I proposed cancelling the expedition, awaiting more favourable circumstances. Alarmed that Napoleon might now try to make a bid for power, this only made the Directory want him to leave even more. The Directory finally accepted that the invasion of England was a non-starter, and with some reluctance, gave the go-ahead for the Egyptian campaign, though they also said they expected him to be back in Paris within 6 months. Their consent was also probably motivated by wishing to get such a popular and ambitious character at a loose end in Paris something to do, and away from the capital. They certainly knew that Napoleon, even then, only had to lift a finger to seize power. Napoleon might well conquer Egypt for France, or, just as welcome, return after a defeat, with his reputation satisfyingly tarnished. As the pro-Bonapartist Whig MP, Lord Holland, was to put it, they sent him there, partly to get rid of him, partly to gratify him, and partly to dazzle and delight that portion of Parisian society who had considerable influence of public opinion. Regardless, Napoleon was delighted. Besides, inactivity did not suit him, and tended to bring out his melancholy streak. Paris has a short memory. If I remain any longer doing nothing, then I am lost. In this great Babylon, one reputation quickly succeeds another. Paris weighs on me like a leaden mantle. Napoleon's friends observed that a free flight in space is what such wings demand, or he will die here. He must go. During Napoleon's absence in northern France, a lull had fallen over the Rue de la Victoire, and yet another scandal for Josephine. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, Josephine had managed to get herself embroiled with the Baudin Company, one of the firms of corrupt profiteers that had expanded during this period to exploit army contracts. Such activities had made politicians like Barras and bankers like Ouvrard immensely rich. Significantly, Hippolyte Charles was also involved in this dubious company, and in fact had just abandoned his place in the army to work more closely with them. But taking advantage of a country at war was not a pretty business. A newspaper scandal erupted. The company was accused of providing the French army with poor quality horses, requisitioned from farmers whom it had neglected to pay. Rumours of Josephine's entanglement with this company reached the ears of Napoleon's brother, Joseph, who was only too happy to tell Napoleon of his wife's secret debts and her involvement in the company. Napoleon despised army profiteers, had taken a hard line against them, and called them the scourge and leprosy of the services. So to have his own wife embroiled in a scandal with them must have infuriated him all the more. Joseph also confirmed that her maid's accusations against Hippolyte had been true, despite Josephine's denials. Napoleon listened to the sordid tale and stormed into Josephine's boudoir, outraged. In a letter to her lover, Hippolyte, Josephine detailed their argument. Joseph had a long conversation with his brother yesterday. Afterwards, he asked me if I knew Baudin, if it was not me who procured the contract with the army of Italy. He had been told that Hippolyte lived at Baudin's home, 100 Rue Saint-Honore, and asked me if it was there that I went every day. I responded that I didn't know anything about what he was saying, that if he wanted a divorce he only had to say so, that he did not need to resort to such accusations, and that I was the most unfortunate of women and the most unhappy. Yes, my Hippolyte, I hate all of them. You alone have my tenderness and my love. They must see how I loathe them by the terrible state I have been in for several days. They can see my disappointment, my despair at being deprived of the chance of seeing you as often as I wish. Hippolyte, I shall kill myself. I would rather die than lead a life that cannot be devoted to you. Alas, what have I done to these monsters? They must see how I abhor them. I hate them all. But however much they torment me, they shall never part me from my Hippolyte. My last sigh shall be for him. you alone have my love." Then Josephine got down to business and tried to cover her tracks. "Please tell Baudin to say that he doesn't know me, that it was not through me that he got the army contract. Tell him to instruct the porter at number 100 to tell anyone who asks if Baudin lives there to say that he doesn't know him. Tell Baudin not to use the letters which I have given him for Italy until sometime after his arrival in that country, and only when he needs to. I will do everything I can to see you today. If I am unable to, I will go to Baudin's tonight and tomorrow morning. I will send Blondin down to tell you what time to meet me in the Parc Monceau. My Hippolyte, 1,000 kisses, as burning and as passionate as my heart." Although Josephine's alleged letters to Hippolyte show passionate feelings, there was also contradictory evidence to suggest that she was settling happily into the role of heroic conqueror's wife and was becoming more and more attached to her husband, who she now wanted to join on his upcoming campaign to Egypt. Josephine may have, at this point, become torn between the two men, each of who appealed to different parts of her personality. Surprisingly, Napoleon did not pursue any further the accusations made against Josephine. But as he contemplated a new campaign in Egypt, Napoleon had every reason to wish to escape from Paris, a place he had come to equate with corruption, disloyalty, heartache, secret malice, and the potential for deep embarrassment. He always had a certain idea of himself as a noble French knight, like Clisson from his own short story, and the behaviour of both the Directory and Josephine threatened that ideal. It was time to double the stakes once again, and so Napoleon turned his attention to the next task at hand. Napoleon had just 10 weeks to organise, assemble and equip the entire expedition to Egypt, which would be the most powerful fleet seen in the Mediterranean for over 200 years. Passing from place to place, Napoleon wrote to intellectuals, spoke with generals, raised money, collected ships, and accumulated supplies. Yet, he somehow also managed to find the time to attend 8 science lectures at the Institut de France. One of his aides, apologising for not fully completing a task, tried to justify himself. "I worked all day," he said. Napoleon replied, "But did you not have the night also?" To another, he said, "Now, monsieur, make haste. Remember that the world was created in 6 days. Ask me for whatever you please, except time. That is the only thing which is beyond my power." Napoleon was also busy recruiting a different kind of army, of scholars, scientists and artists. For the first time in history, literature, science and art would form a key part of an army. Due to English spies, Napoleon did not tell most of these recruits where they were going. He simply invited them to join him on a new expedition. One of the intellectuals, Dubois-Aimé, recorded, "We did not know where Bonaparte would take us, because the objective of the expedition had been kept rigorously secret. But that didn't matter to us. The celebrated warrior inspired us with a blind confidence." Among those who accepted the invitation was Stael, the naturalist, Comte, an authority on balloon warfare and the inventor of the lead pencil, Muse, a mineralogist who gave his name to the Dolomite Mountains, Fourier, a brilliant mathematician specializing in the study of heat, Vivant Denon, a gifted artist with a taste for adventure, Redoute, the celebrated flower painter, and Berthollet, the leading chemist. But before accepting his invitation, Napoleon's friend, the mathematician Monge, had to resolve a delicate marital problem. His wife objected to him going on the adventure, arguing that at 52 he was too old. Napoleon paid her a visit to convince her otherwise, but when the door was opened, because of his youth, her maid mistook him for one of Professor Monge's students. There were some refusals. Jacques Delis, whose poetry Napoleon had enjoyed as a schoolboy, regretted that at 60 he was too old. The composer, Muse, did not want to leave France. And the singer, Loy, was afraid of catching a chill. Like many, he assumed that Napoleon's destination was the Netherlands. Within 10 weeks, Napoleon had recruited 150 civilians, which included almost every talented young scientist in France. It was a far cry from just a few years ago, when the scientist Lavoisier had been sent to the guillotine with the words, "The Republic has no need of scientists." Such gigantic preparations could not be made without attracting attention, but the utmost secrecy had to be maintained. If England found out, she might intercept the French fleet, or incite the Mameluke rulers of Egypt to prepare resistance. As part of the misinformation campaign, Napoleon spoke openly in the salons about the holiday he was hoping to take to Germany with Josephine and some friends. And to further the ruse, Napoleon was officially reconfirmed as commander of the Army of England. Where Napoleon was going was the universal question. Some said he was going to the Black Sea, or to India, to cut a canal through the Isthmus of Suez, to Ireland, to the Thames. Even General Kleber guessed that they were bound for England, and said, "Well, if you throw a fire ship into the Thames, put Kleber on board of her, and you shall see what he will do." Captain Honoré Fay, an engineer from a prominent Huguenot family, was then reporting for duty in Toulon, and recorded in his memoirs that the French Republic wanted, at last, to revenge itself on London for the defeats and adversities that afflicted our nascent liberty, and through which the British cabinet has sought, for many years, to strangle the inexorable expansion of the new republic, which sooner or later must defeat them. The English government was perplexed, foreseeing that a storm was gathering, but they did not know where it would strike. They summoned a powerful fleet, placed under the command of Admiral Horatio Nelson, to cruise the Mediterranean and watch out for any French movements. Before Napoleon left for Toulon, he had one more project closer to home to think of. Like all affluent Parisians, Josephine wanted to buy a country house. She dragged him to view Malmaison, an exquisite chateau that she had fallen in love with 4 years earlier, and had coveted ever since. But, bearing in mind her revamp and the recent purchase of their current house, Napoleon felt that Malmaison was too expensive, and the matter seemed closed. By the end of April 1798, the secret plans for the Egyptian campaign were complete. 5 months after his Italian campaign, Napoleon was stationed in Toulon and confronted by an awe-inspiring sight. The entire French fleet, whose masts resembled a huge forest, at anchor in the harbour, and its ships spreading out almost a mile to sea. His old army of Italy was drawn up to welcome back its general and greeted him with cheers. Napoleon declared, "Soldiers, you are one of the wings of the Army of England. You have made war in the mountains, war in the plains, and war in the cities. It remains for you to make it on the ocean. The Roman legions, whom you have often imitated, but never yet equalled, fought Carthage in the seas and on the plains of Zama by turns. Victory never deserted their standards, because they never ceased to be brave, patient, and united. Soldiers, the eyes of Europe are upon you. You have great destinies to accomplish, battles to fight, dangers and fatigues to overcome. You are about to do more than you have done yet, for the prosperity of your country, the happiness of man, and for your own glory." Cheers erupted, punctuated by shouts of "Vive la République!" One young officer at Toulon later wrote, "I was far from having any idea of the nature of the armament that was prepared, and even less of its destination, when I threw myself, like so many other young persons, into that audacious expedition. I was seduced by the renown of the Commander-in-Chief and by the glory of our arms. It was a delirium, a nearly universal compulsion." In Toulon that night, the house of the revolutionary local government was illuminated, and the troops planted a tree of liberty at its door, with the inscription, "It grows each day." One of Napoleon's last acts before leaving France was to issue a protest to the military commissioner in Toulon, urging him to be merciful in carrying out the Directory's most recent edict against suspected royalists. "I have learned, citizens, with deep regret, that an old man between 70 and 80 years of age, and some unfortunate women in a state of pregnancy, or surrounded by children of tender age, have been shot on the charge of being émigrés. Have the soldiers of liberty become executioners? Can the mercy which they have shown, even in the fury of battle, be extinct in their hearts? The law of the 19th Fructidor was a measure of public safety. Its aim was to reach conspirators, not women and old men. I therefore exhort you, citizens, whenever the law presents at your tribunal women or old men, to declare that, in the field of battle, Frenchmen respect the old and the women, even of their enemies. The officer who signs a sentence against a person incapable of bearing weapons is a coward. Forced to wait 6 more days for a storm to pass, Napoleon took Josephine to inspect his fleet's enormous flagship, the Orient. It was meant to be the greatest battleship of the time, and was certainly one of the biggest. More than 6,000 great oak trees had been felled to create it. Home to 2,000 soldiers, sailors, scholars, and craftsmen, the ship was so vast that it was called the Wooden World. Josephine had joined Napoleon in Toulon because he wanted to enjoy her company for as long as possible. Neither of them seemed eager for a long separation. But Napoleon had not yet decided whether to take her with him to Egypt. Josephine spent much of the time trying to convince him to let her join him, saying that, being brought up in Martinique, the trials of exotic lands held nothing new for her. But Napoleon did not want Josephine to risk the dangerous journey. Sailing through the Mediterranean, being chased by the powerful English fleet, bent on destroying them, was undeniably a risky bet. The English navy was so superior that if the two enemy fleets only crossed each other's paths, the French ships would very likely have been sunk. One morning, when Napoleon and Josephine were laying in late, one of his officers and close friends, Alexandre Dumas, a handsome black general of immense physical strength, whose son would later write the French classics, The Three Musketeers, and The Count of Monte Cristo, walked in on the couple lying in bed in the middle of a disagreement. Dumas noticed that Josephine was in tears. "She wants to go to Egypt," Napoleon explained. "Are you taking your wife, Dumas?" "Gracious no, sir," Dumas replied. "It's traditional for soldiers' wives to follow later." Napoleon agreed. "If we are there for several years, then we will send for our wives." And he punctuated the last word with a playful slap on Josephine's behind. Some ships believed to be English were spotted near Toulon on the 18th of May. It turned out to be a false alarm, but the scare only strengthened Napoleon's conviction that Josephine should remain safely on dry land. Still eager to start a family with her, he thought that she should stay in France and visit Plombières instead, a spa town famous for its baths that were said to boost fertility. On the morning of the 18th of May 1798, Napoleon ordered 6 salvos to be fired, the signal for everyone on shore to board the 100 ships. But this was only one part of the total forces. 3 more smaller fleets, sailing from Italian ports, would swell the number of troops to 55,000, equal to the size of a fairly large city at the time, and the number of ships to over 350. It was the largest fleet to ever sail the Mediterranean. In command of it all was a general who was not yet 30 years old. The horses were led on board first, tethered in improvised stables. Then went the group of civilians, scientists, administrators, jurists, archaeologists, engineers, artists, and intellectuals who would try to organize Egypt's society and bring to light the riches that had been sleeping for millennia in the land of the pharaohs. The force also included, as usual, spies in the pay of the Directory, with orders to report on the political behavior of the generals. Last but not least, 7,000 troops marched aboard the ships with a show of great élan, reminding more than one eyewitness of grooms enthusiastically going off to their wedding. The cannoneer, Louis Bricard, spoke of a supernatural joy among them, though he did say that their girlfriends in the port did not share it, complaining tearfully that the flower of young French manhood was being sent away without knowing their destination, and they worried that they might never return. At daybreak on the 19th of May, Napoleon emotionally said goodbye to Josephine, whose last dainty words to him were, "If you get to Thebes, do bring me one of those pretty obelisks." As Napoleon had been warned by his brothers that Josephine was seeing too much of Hippolyte Charles, for the sake of propriety, he asked her to keep away from him. Josephine promised that she would. Every gun on every ship, and in the port's fortress, fired a simultaneous salute and unfurled their flags, which must have been an intensely satisfying sight for the young general who, just 5 years earlier, had arrived at this same harbour as a nameless, penniless captain with a refugee family who had just been driven out of Corsica. Surrounded by his generals, Napoleon then gave his final orders and boarded the Orient. One young sailor wrote of the sight, "What a magnificent spectacle! I saw General Bonaparte for the first time, and I was struck by his severe and imposing features. He was enveloped by a halo of glory that made him seem very great to me." Josephine, along with the other officers' wives, adjourned to a balcony which overlooked the bay. The sails were raised, but as the fleet sailed out of the harbour, the overloaded Orient dragged along the seabed and listed sharply. The spectators gasped in alarm, but the ship soon righted itself and pulled out into the open sea. With a fanfare of brass bands, cannon fire and singing, the fleet set out into the brilliant sunshine and onto what would be called the most spectacular expedition since the Crusades, and certainly one of the most tumultuous.